Hello and welcome everybody. This is Pirate Mage 12 and today's video is not quite a tutorial, but rather an interpretation of another tutorial. As I've said countless times before, the beautiful paint scheme I'm using for my Tyranids was actually created by someone else. They're basically Catgut Painting's Dune Devil Scorpion Tyranids. I've made a few modifications to his recipe and some of you have told me they'd be interested to watch me paint it. And of course, I'm not claiming to be better or have the cooler recipe than Catgut Painting, I'm just working my own preferences into an existing color scheme. This is the miniature I'll be painting, a converted Genestealer with added chitin plates and spikes. You'll find a tutorial for green stuff use in general elsewhere on my channel. Check it out if you're trying to set foot in the fantastical realm of sculpting. Part 1. The Carapace. To be honest, I hadn't made up my mind right until the moment I put the brush to the miniature. I'm beginning to work out the pattern on the carapace, namely triangles on the head plates. The color I use is Vallejo Model Color German Camel Black Brown. It's not too clean yet, so I'll rework that later. No biggie, so to speak. The horn on the forehead is going to be as dark as the rest of it. Next up is the carapace itself. I'm painting everything the same dark brown as the pattern on the head. And here comes the first rework step. During the filming of the paint job, I made one mistake that cost me lots and lots of time. Instead of reworking all the white parts in one go after all the other areas were done, I went for it after each single step. So instead of maybe 90 minutes, this paint job took me upwards of 3 hours. The color I used is Vallejo Game Color White Primer. Once that rework step is done, I'm adding some more detail to the skin. Dark brown spots around the joints. This serves to visually connect the limbs to the carapace. If you want to do something similar, make sure the spread is not too even or it'll look pretty artificial. Same thing at the legs, just add spots until you're happy with the look. And especially when working on spots like these, it's a very good idea to keep your paint moisturized, almost wet. Those spots don't have to be perfectly symmetrical. It's enough if they're roughly the same size. Some variation is good because variation means naturality and naturality means imperfection. Back to the carapace and the first highlight. I just added 1 part Army Painter Matte White to 3 parts German Camel Black Brown. These highlights aren't absolutely necessary, but it'll emphasize the elevated areas and therefore create some more depth. The horn is highlighted in the same fashion as the carapace, except I'm always painting both edges. A fine line at the top of the head's chitin plates highlights their jagged edges. By mixing 2 parts German camel black brown and 1 part army painter matte black, I create a darker color, which I'm diluting with a further 2 parts water. The final result is a very thin, dark paint, which I use to create darker shadows in the deepest recesses of the carapace. Paint also goes below the actual chitin plates, for example here under the tail. Part 2. Skin details. The next color I use is Army Painter Monster Brown, which goes in all the deeper recesses of the skin. I like to use it to improve the contrast of the washes in the later steps. It helps bring out the darker shades, which I definitely want in the darker areas. This color also goes into most of the joints and between exoskeleton overlaps. Not even the feet are safe. Next step, I use Army Painter Strong Tone to shade the weird horizontal muscle windows or whatever they're supposed to be, maybe trachees? Anyway, another round of shading to get some more depth on the miniature. Part 3. Skin color. With Army Painter Light Tone, I washed the entire model, all the limbs, the entire torso, and the full carapace. Whenever I use light tone, I thin it down with 1 part Army Painter wash mixing medium to 3 parts light tone. This step requires a surprising amount of concentration and focus. You may have a lot of time to correct mistakes, but once the wash has dried, it'll be hard to fix. The most valuable advice I can give is that you make sure you understand how a wash behaves under your brush and how it tends to pool. The direction into which your brush is moving always plays a huge role. Take a close look. When the brush hits a spot, it'll lose some of its load. By moving your brush, you'll take a part of that load with you wherever the brush is going. While you're thinning the layer of paint with the direction you're going, You'll at some point come to another recess, and it will pool there. Just pay some attention and you'll work it out eventually. It might be hard to reach all the areas right now. For me, it's usually the upper limbs that I keep missing spots on. Just turn your miniature around and take a close look. Remember, you'll have plenty of time to fix mistakes, but you shouldn't do too many layers with washes. Next rework phase. This is one major point where I'm deviating from CatGut's tutorial. I like to highlight some additional edges with pure white before I slap the next wash layer on. It just gives the model the extra crispness and definition I like. This is not to say I'm doing it better. As I mentioned before, all I do is work my own preferences into my Tyranids. On top of that, I'm not painting an army, so I can afford the extra time it takes to do some additional steps. The highlights just go wherever an edge is raised. I have to say, I'm quite proud of myself for adding the plates. GENESTEALER heads usually tend to look like pears or butts, big round surfaces anyway, which makes them notoriously hard to paint. These plates, however, add detail while allowing for an easier paint job at the same time, and of course they have to be highlighted. Next step, a second layer of 3 parts light tone and 1 part wash mixing medium. But this time, I only paint the torso and the highest segments of each limb. After both layers of light tone have dried, I paint another CARAPACE highlight with the same mix of 3 parts German camel black brown and 1 part matte white. The wash has darkened the entire structure, so I paint the mix all around the CARAPACE's edges to emphasize its shape. Next up, mix 1 part Army Painter red tone with 1 part light tone and add an additional 1 part of wash mixing medium. Then wash the middle limbs with the mix to receive a soft, warm red shade. Again, make sure you hit all the spots. Maybe you are better at this than I am, but I can't help missing absurdly large spots. Luckily, through the magic of video editing, you won't be able to see how incompetent I really am. I also wash the mouth area with the mix to go for a more natural look. And one more step for the skin. Paint the final segment with a mix of 3 parts red tone and 1 part wash mixing medium. Part 4. Claws, horns, and eyes. Everything that's going to be black on the final miniature. And we're getting close, woohoo! So this step is actually pretty self-explanatory. Just paint the claws, the nails, the horns black. Pure army paint a matte black will do. The only thing that you could be worried about in this step is that you might get some paint on a part of the skin. Even the feet have claws that put a raptor to shame. Look at those claws. And then paint them. The eyes require a more delicate brush, so I use the double-aught one. I paint the entire eye socket black, and when I screw up, I just let out a happy little scream of anger and frustration, and then use some army paint a skeleton bone to cover it up. And pretend it's just a highlight I wanted to be there, and go on painting. To finish the eyes, I paint a tiny little spot of pure matte white right into the center. This one's a little tricky and requires a steady hand, but screwing up is no biggie. You might have to try a few times, but the result is definitely worth it. One neat trick I picked up a few years ago is to hold your breath while painting fine details like that. Just for a few seconds. Not for too long, because your heart will start racing and your hands will become shaky. But for a few seconds it's okay and it'll steady your hand. And of course, some of the black went on the edges of the eye socket. See how well the skeleton bone fits the highlight colors? Yep, told you, this is experience. Finally, for some highlights to the black parts, just add 1 part of army paint a uniform gray to 3 parts matte black and paint both the upper and the lower edges of the claws, and the nails, and the horns, etc. Have the 2 highlight lines meet at the tip. Games Workshop's heavy metal studios painted their miniatures horns simply by drawing vertical lines of increasing brightness from the base to the tip. And I personally have always liked that, so I'll adapt that for now. Add an additional part of uniform gray to the mix and just paint a final line on the edges of the claws. That'll create a sense of depth. Then add another extra part uniform gray and do the same thing over and over again, and keep it just a tiny bit finer than I do here. At some point, you can also start adding vertical lines to the horizontal highlights. That'll make the claws look a little used. To highlight the horns, draw another brighter line from base to top. Do it as fine as possible and start a little bit higher than you did with the previous lines. And repeat that both on the other side and with an even brighter highlight color. Now for the tongue. I paint the first layer with Army Painter Crusted Sore, gross name, and then I also paint the roof of the mouth and the onset of the esophagus. Then I wash the inner part of the tongue, the one that's not stuck out, with a diluted equal mix of matte black and crusted sore, before I highlight it with an equal mix of crusted sore and matte white. By painting little horizontal lines instead of just following the edges, the tongue will appear more textured and a little grosser. Then it's time for the teeth. I paint a layer of skeleton bone as the foundation, followed by a single highlight of Army Painter mummy robes. Part 5. Base. Yeah, we're almost done! All that's left to do is to paint the entire base with Monster Brown. I do hate that part. Every single time I paint bases, I either end up with a huge amount of leftover paint, or I thin my paint too much and have to do multiple coats. Watery coats. But honestly, the worst thing that could happen to you at this point is that you might have to do a second coat. So don't worry. I'm just exaggerating. A second layer of 2 parts Monster Brown and 1 part Mummy Robes is then painted on top of the base coat. Don't worry about coverage, just loosely dabble it on. Don't dry brush it yet, just have some fun. The larger stones on the base receive a quick base coat of diluted Army Painter Necromancer Cloak, followed immediately by a highlight with 1 additional part Army Painter Ash Grey, and then another one, again with an additional part of Ash Grey. Next step, a quick dry brush with a mix of equal parts Monster Brown and Mummy Robes serves to get some easy highlights. Be careful though, don't use too much pressure and don't paint everything. Also, don't forget to brush your feet. And a final dry brush with pure Mummy Brown helps seal the deal. All that's left is some manual highlights with a regular brush. Just paint some edges with pure Mummy Brown. It'll blend the brushed and the painted parts together really nicely. final step is to paint the rim of the base. You may of course do a brown rim or a red rim. I've seen things these days, but I personally like it black. This time I'm using Citadel Abaddon black because I feel it sticks much better than Army Painter matte black. When I got back into the hobby after a 2-year hiatus, I used matte black to paint the rim of my Terminator Tech Marine, and despite setting for a full night, it came off at the touch of my fingers. And I really don't have a grip like a vice. After painting multiple layers of black, voila, we're done. Thank you for sticking with me through the entire video. I hope you had just as much fun watching as I had painting. Don't forget to like and subscribe, it's much appreciated. And of course, hope to see you soon. Bye!